Marvel's Avengers should have been amazing. With a score of 67 on Metacritic and a 4.9 user score, it's clear that this game missed the mark by quite a large margin. But why did it flop so hard? Honestly, it's a combination of a lot of things. Avengers' boring gameplay, live service model, microtransactions, performance issues, and ridiculous exclusivity deals factor into the total mess that this game became. CrystalDynamics and Eidos-Montreal, the minds behind the modern Tomb Raider games, were the ones tasked with creating this game. And with the game being published by SquareEnix, Marvel's Avengers seemed like it would have been a success. Obviously, the core of every single video game in existence is its gameplay. It seems like a no-brainer that an action game based on some of the most popular superheroes of all time would be absolutely awesome. While I can see the merit in what Avengers is attempting to do with its gameplay, it still falls flat significantly. That is something that you will continually hear me say in this video. A game like this should have been incredible. The setup was there for them, but the execution was just so poorly done. The best way I can describe the actual gameplay of Avengers is that it's trying to be the Batman Arkham franchise with aspects of Destiny and Warframe sloppily mixed in. I will say that each of the different Avengers feel distinct and have interesting movesets. The only characters that are somewhat similar are Hawkeye and Kate Bishop, but at the same time they have so much that's different about them that it's not even fair to draw a comparison. However, the worst part about the gameplay is just how boring it is. You end up fighting the same handful of enemies for the entire game. The only thing that actually changes with them is that they receive a ton more health later on. There are so many unique antagonists that could have been used here as bosses. It legitimately baffles me that only a few of Marvel's iconic villains were seen at all. Instead, they decided to settle with the Avengers facing off against meaningless enemies that just barely have any semblance of being from the Marvel Universe. This is also true for the actual locations that you visit in the game. Until the War for Wakanda expansion released, there were only a select few biomes that the game took place in. The gear system is another gameplay factor that needs to be reworked. The gear that you unlock throughout each mission really doesn't serve much of a purpose in the long run of your adventure. Each piece of gear you unlock does make your hero stronger, but by the time you even complete another mission, you've already unlocked new gear that outclasses it. It just all feels meaningless. By the time you actually have a set loadout of gear that doesn't constantly change, you've reached the endgame. Pun intended. The issue with that is that there isn't any substantial endgame content for the player to use their new gear in. The gear serves no purpose other than making the numbers go up, and by the time it actually means something, all of the game's fun is over. I honestly think that CrystalDynamics need to go back and totally overhaul the gear system from scratch. Thankfully, that's what they've promised that they're going to do, which is an amazing thing. A big mistake on the part of CrystalDynamics is that they focused too much on the multiplayer side of the game. Apparently this was due to pressure from SquareEnix for the game to feature co-op. This focus on multiplayer caused other parts of the game to be lacking due to lots of resources being put towards this multiplayer mode. The co-op mode that was implemented really feels like it was a second thought. The real meat and potatoes of Avengers is in its single-player campaigns. A lot of people say that the single-player campaign is great. I'm part of the camp that thinks it's just average. The story isn't really anything too special. The plot about the Avengers breaking up is certainly interesting, but when the concept is translated into actual gameplay, it just falls flat. The fact that Captain America and Thor aren't even playable in a game called Marvel's Avengers until the last 2 hours of the campaign is just baffling to me. I do agree with the fact that the single-player campaigns are the most fun that you'll have in Avengers, but honestly, that's not saying too much overall. Another glaring flaw in Marvel's Avengers is the performance of the game. Now let me preface this in saying that I am a PC gamer at heart. I can only speak for the PC version of the game. My gaming rig is nowhere even close to the most powerful PC in the world, but it gets the job done. I own 94 games on Steam as of this video, with a bunch more on other platforms, and Marvel's Avengers is the only game that has ever given me any serious trouble. According to PCGameBenchmark.com, my computer does exceed the recommended specifications that the game requires. This shows that there's no reason that the game should be giving my computer a hard time on some of the lowest graphical settings. I know this isn't just an issue for me because I've seen countless times on Reddit that people with better computers than I have were having even worse results. Due to these observations, I've determined that this game just doesn't have the optimization that it needed. Now I will say that the game has run slightly better with each additional update. The fairly recent addition of AMD Fidelity FX Super Resolution is awesome and allowed for my game to run so much better. The game is basically a masterpiece right now compared to how messy and buggy it was when it first launched. I understand that COVID was probably a factor in why this game's optimization is messy, as with many of the other issues that Avengers has, but there was no reason that the game should have released in a state that it ended up releasing in. The first patch released for the game alone had over 1,000 bugs patched. You did hear me correctly, that's 1 with 3 zeros. I respect that the developers are going back and trying to clean up their mess, but the damage is already done. Now, before I get into the major reasons that I believe that Marvel's Avengers failed, I want to highlight one of the most confusing exclusivity deals of all time. In August 2020, a month before the game was set to launch, CrystalDynamics announced that Spider-Man would become a playable character at some point in Avengers' lifespan. Now, on its own, that's a great thing. Everybody loves Spider-Man. The issue here is that he was announced to only be coming to the PlayStation 4 and 5 releases of the game. I do understand that Sony has the film rights to Spider-Man, but the video game rights to the character do not extend only to Sony. Case in point, Spider-Man was featured in 2019's Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3 on the Nintendo Switch. This shows that it's possible, but Sony and CrystalDynamics chose to be anti-consumer and alienate 2/3 of the player base. This odd decision for the game actually caused me to pass on Marvel's Avengers at launch. I only ended up purchasing it later on when I didn't have to pay full price for it. On a little side note, it's almost 2022 and Spider-Man is just now being released for PlayStation owners at the end of this month. While everything I discussed previously was certainly a factor in why Marvel's Avengers was a failure, I feel that the largest issue that the game has is its microtransactions and live service model. It's pretty much a given at this point that most games in 2021 have some kind of extra monetization. Whether it's DLC packs or additional costumes, it's pretty much just accepted at this point. For free-to-play games like Fortnite or Apex Legends, I totally understand it. The developers need to monetize those games in some way for them to be profitable. What I don't understand is why these overpriced cosmetics are being sold in a game that already costed $39.99 to own. And that's not even the worst of it. Marvel's Avengers used to be $60 before the developers realized how much it bombed and lowered the price. The price of the cosmetics is nothing too special on its own. The price of Avengers' premium currency is pretty standard when compared to other games. However, the real predatory business model at play here is when CrystalDynamics began to make the game pay to win. In March of 2021, the rate at which your heroes level up was drastically slowed down. With this change, the developers released the option to buy XP boosts for real-world money. While this practice is scummy on its own, it's even worse when you consider the fact that the developers had promised that the microtransactions would only be cosmetic. I suppose this was their last-ditch effort for the game to make back some of its very expensive development costs. Live service games are certainly something that has plagued the gaming industry for a long time now. While it's proven to be successful in the past with games such as Nintendo's Splatoon and free-to-play giants like Fortnite and Apex Legends, in a case like this, it was done totally wrong. Live service models rarely work. It's possible to put them in a free game like Fortnite, but when they intrude their way into a game like Avengers, that's a recipe for failure every single time. The reason why this is an issue is that Marvel's Avengers didn't have much content at launch to boast about in the first place. It's really messed up when the developers rush out a game with no content only to add it in over the course of a few years. This is a practice that needs to be stopped in the gaming industry as a whole, and not just in the case of Marvel's Avengers. At this current moment, the game barely has any more content than what it launched with, and that saddens me. Marvel's Avengers certainly was both a critical and financial failure. As I stated before, this game should have been incredible. The perfect setup was right in front of the developers the entire time. They had the license to use some of the most iconic superheroes of all time. They also had some truly great developers at their disposal. When looking at CrystalDynamics' past track record, it's clear that they usually have put out much more well-received work. So what went wrong this time? It definitely had to do with some interference from SquareEnix. Their push for the developers to include a multiplayer mode for the game definitely threw a wrench in their plans. The recent release of Eidos-Montreal's Guardians of the Galaxy game shows that the minds behind Marvel's Avengers were definitely capable of providing a great product. However, the difference between Guardians of the Galaxy and Marvel's Avengers is that Guardians of the Galaxy isn't trying to add co-op to a game that doesn't need it. The strongest aspects of Avengers are its single-player features. That's where most of the praise for the game comes from. Despite the missteps on behalf of CrystalDynamics, I could tell they're really trying to make Marvel's Avengers work. I truly respect their choice to not just abandon the game completely. It reminds me a lot of how Star Wars Battlefront 2 saw a complete overhaul because of the backlash it received. If that comparison is anything to go off of, hopefully Marvel's Avengers has a renaissance later on in its life. However, I truly am worried about the future of the game. Because of how much of a financial failure that this game was, I'm honestly fairly worried if there is going to be any more substantial content at all. It all depends how much money that Square is willing to throw at CrystalDynamics to make more content that may or may not earn the money back at all. Recently, the president of SquareEnix said in a statement that the financial results of Marvel's Avengers have been disappointing. Pretty much any content that's being added to Avengers at this point is being created at a loss for SquareEnix. And that's a real shame. Data miners discovered so many different characters that were at one point being planned for Marvel's Avengers. It's pretty much unknown if most of them will see the light of day. A possible solution to make up some of the development costs of the game is to make Avengers free to play. However, while that would get many more players to try out the game, it would be unfair for those who purchased the game for full price at launch. Marvel's Avengers unfortunately didn't live up to the expectations that we all set for it. However, that doesn't mean that Marvel games are doomed for the rest of eternity. Games like Guardians of the Galaxy and Marvel's Spider-Man prove that there is a lot of potential for games with these iconic characters. The misstep of Marvel's Avengers is thankfully not putting an end to Marvel's expansion into the world of video games. Maybe one day a truly fulfilling Avengers game will be made with the proper planning, love, and care.